Russian presidential elections took place on 18th of March. They were held in Russia-annexed Crimea as well. International organizations such as OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights and European Union didn't send any monitors as they do not recognize Russian status on the peninsula. However, Kremlin itself invited, as they claimed, independent monitors. But the report by Anton Shekhovtsov, a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and politologist, discovered that many of them in fact have Kremlin links. We have Anton with us and we will ask them about details from the report. Anton, thanks. Hi, thanks for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So my first question is, how did you discover the information? How did you discover what were the people in the Crimea?
Yes, it was a bit of a difficult task because the Central Electoral Committee of the Russian Federation stopped publishing lists of observers that it invited for various types of elections, not only for presidential election, but also for some other types of elections. So essentially it was going through the media, Russian media, through social networks like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and trying to discover the names of people and also how they are, how they sound in English or how they look in English. And I tried to confirm from several sources whether those people were indeed observing elections in Russia-annexed Crimea. So it was essentially, I think, what is usually called OSINT operation, gathering intelligence from open sources.
And how do you explain why is this report important? What are the key points of that, and what information is the most valuable?
Well, it was, I think, the most important thing is to establish who exactly went to Crimea, because according to the Ukrainian law, this is illegal to go to Crimea via Russia. So essentially, those people, they committed a crime against the Ukrainian state. It was also important to realize or to establish any sort of connections between these people and the authorities in Russia, and also to look whether those people had been previously engaged in any pro-Kremlin efforts or operations. And some of them were indeed previously engaged in those efforts, in those activities.
There are actually many interesting persons in this report. We at Hromadske have read it, but can you explain more for our audience? Who are these people, from what countries are they, and what people are the most interesting, the most, I don't know, interesting people?
Yeah, so let me tell you that, first of all, in comparison to the so-called referendum in Crimea on the 16th of March 2014, the political representation this time, in March this year, was much lower. So, in my opinion, as far as I understand, the Russian authorities or the Crimean authorities, they failed to mobilize many of the people they would like to mobilize and invite them to Crimea. If, for example, 4 years ago, there were more than 40 politicians, acting politicians, present as so-called observers of the referendum. Now I counted only maybe around 20 of people were actual politicians. And some of the names that are already familiar to us were Johan Beckman, an activist, a pro-Kremlin activist from Finland, who brought an entire delegation from Finland together with him. But he was the only official observer at the election. Then Andreas Maurer, who is a politician from Germany. He's a regional politician representing the left-wing party or far-left party in Germany, Die Linke. And again, going back to the referendum in 2014, there were at least 3 people from Die Linke present in Crimea at the referendum. But now it was only 1, and it was from a regional council. Then there was a representative of a far-right party, of a German far-right party called Alternative for Germany. He was also observing this election. Another person who is already known to us, to the experts who are dealing with the Russian influence, is Sereda Trifkovic. She's an activist. She's not a politician, but she's an activist, pro-Kremlin activist from Serbia. And talking in general about the political representation, I would also mention the Cypriot left-wing party. They sent 2 or 3 people to Crimea. Then some left-wing party from Venezuela. There were also people from the centrist parties or center-left parties and the center-right parties from France. There was nobody from the Front National, from the National Front, from the far-right party, although one could expect someone to come to Crimea because the National Front is a very much pro-Kremlin party, but there was nobody. As far as I know, there was nobody present in Crimea, although some of the National Front activists and politicians went to Russia to observe this election.
Yes, it is quite interesting. For example, you mentioned this German politician from far-left Die Linke party. They have really mixed position on Ukraine. They condemn annexation. They call it illegal, annexation of Crimea. But as well, they have communists in their party. So how did Kremlin pick these people? Because we are really interested, how did they invite them, how did they choose them? And this Die Linke party, they are far left, but how would you explain that?
You know, it's not that the Kremlin picks up those people. The Kremlin, if we by the Kremlin mean at least the State Duma or the Federation Council, they simply send invitations to people. But those people, those politicians who eventually would go to Crimea, they were previously in contact with some other organizations which are not necessarily linked to the Kremlin directly. So there are gongos, which is a word for government-organized, non-government organizations, essentially very pro-Kremlin organizations, but not necessarily connected to the Kremlin, which do this business in terms of finding individual observers. And they send them invitations first, which are being followed by the official invitations from the State Duma or the Federation Council. For example, there is a NGO or association called Civic Control Association, which already participated in selecting or finding those people for the fake electoral processes or fraudulent electoral processes. There is also National Monitoring Organization in Russia. They are not part of the Kremlin, they are not part of the authorities, but they find those people and then pass those lists to the authorities, which formally invite them.
And we are in particular interested in 2 people. For example, the first is the former election monitor member of OSCE mission, and he had links to Kremlin, and he has been monitoring elections in Ukraine as well. And also you mentioned in your report a Ukrainian woman. So what can you say about these people? What were their role?
Well, there was a woman, Tatiana Mele, who was referred to as a Ukrainian citizen, or as an observer from Ukraine. However, if you look at her social profiles, you will find out that she no longer lives in Ukraine. She lived in St. Petersburg. She doesn't call herself Tetiana, she calls herself Tatiana, so in Russian spelling. And I also have a suspicion that now she doesn't even live in Russia. So I think she lives in Germany or in some Western European country. So it was only, she was referred to as an observer from Ukraine just for propaganda purposes by the Russian media, to show that there are some people in Ukraine who, say, are interested in what is going on in Russia, in Crimea, but at the same time would justify the annexation of Crimea. And as for the person who, I don't remember his name now, the person who previously went to, or was a participant of one of the OSCE missions, I don't think that it is, like, his previous involvement with the OSCE tells us anything about his position at the moment. But this is how he got in touch, or he was introduced to a Russian citizen who was working for the Civic Control Association that I mentioned. So he invited that foreign observer to Crimea. So this is just how they got in touch in the first place a couple of years ago.
And what can you say? What goals did the Kremlin had by inviting these monitors? Why did they need them?
Essentially, they needed those foreign observers who would go to Crimea just basically for propaganda purposes to try to legitimize the annexation of Crimea in the domestic and international, for the domestic and international audience. Probably mostly for the domestic audience, because, you know, they invited foreign observers to Russia. And in March 2018, so this year, the number of the foreign observers who went to Russia was the highest in comparison to any other electoral processes in Russia. So they really wanted to show that foreign observers would go to Russia and say that the elections were fine. But since there was no organization, no established organization wanted to send any observers to Crimea, they still needed to have foreign observers in Crimea to show that Crimea is not different from any other region of Russia. So if there are foreign observers in Russia, there should be foreign observers in Crimea. So this is essentially for the domestic audience to show that Crimea, again, is not different from any other region in Russia.
And my last question will be, you know, it's really confusing to live in the world where the whole country can play this kind of games, just pretending to be democratic and to be honest. So do you expect your report have any influence on that? Do you think that international organizations should somehow react to this situation?
I only see that the OSCE may react to this report in terms of keeping notes of those people who decided to observe the illegitimate and illegal election in Crimea. So, for example, those people who worked for the OSCE before, I think they will not be invited to any OSCE missions afterwards. But also this report shows how Russia fails to mobilize more or less respected political figures who would go and justify the annexation of Crimea. So this report is about the failure, essentially about failure of the Russian authorities and their attempt to legitimize the occupation of Crimea.
Okay, Anton, thank you very much for your report for your explanation. We will be following the situation. We had with us Anton Shekhovtsov, the political scientist, and he explained us how Russia has invited 43 international monitors to the illegal elections in Crimea and who are those people.